I was still in my Navy uniform when the call came, the nurse's trembling voice delivering the kind of news that cuts deeper than any storm I'd faced at sea. My father had abandoned my grandmother in the hospital 2 days earlier. He said he couldn't handle it anymore, she explained. Those words echoed in my head all the way from Virginia to Ohio. I was a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy, just back from a 7-month deployment aboard the USS Abigail Adams. My body still swayed with the rhythm of the waves when I threw my sea bag into the back of my Jeep and started driving north. 7 states, 4 rest stops, and one question filled the endless road: how could he do this? By the time I reached the hospital, evening had fallen, and the fluorescent lights painted everything pale and lifeless. My grandmother, Margaret Carter, lay in a recovery room surrounded by machines and the faint, mechanical heartbeat of monitors. Her face was thin, her silver hair unkempt, but when her eyes opened and she whispered my name, warmth returned to the sterile air. The doctor explained that she'd suffered a moderate stroke, her right side weak, her speech slurred, her recovery uncertain. When I asked about my father, the nurse averted her gaze. He couldn't stand to see her like this, she murmured. That was my father, Thomas Carter, former football star, businessman, and master of appearances. Strong on the outside, hollow when it mattered, that night, I promised my grandmother I'd stay. Her hand, cool but steady, tightened around mine. You've seen war, child, she said softly. This is nothing. In that moment, I realized that caring for her would be a new kind of battle, one fought not with command or courage, but with patience. Over the next few weeks, I turned my life upside down. I filed for family leave, moved into her old farmhouse, and traded military precision for the quiet discipline of care. Every morning at 6, I helped her stretch, fed her oatmeal, and read aloud from the newspaper. Some days she cried from pain, others from gratitude. At night, when the house fell silent, I'd hear her whisper a small prayer: Lord, give me strength to remember who I am. Sometimes, I found myself whispering it too. The neighbors helped, casseroles, visits, and polite silence about my father's absence. Everyone in town knew, though. Pity floated in their eyes, unspoken but heavy. My grandmother, ever perceptive, once said, "He'll come around when there's something to take." I didn't understand then. All I knew was that the sea had taught me endurance, and now life was teaching me devotion. What I didn't know was that this quiet promise, "I'll stay," would one day lead me into a courtroom facing the man who had once called himself my father. The first winter came quickly. Snow fell over the fields like a soft blanket, muffling the world in silence. Inside that old farmhouse, time seemed to slow down. The walls creaked, the pipes hummed, and the scent of cinnamon tea drifted through every room. Those months became the quietest of my life, but also the most meaningful. Grandma recovered little by little. Her speech returned, her hands steadied, and her laughter, dry but warm, became the heartbeat of the house. Each morning, I'd help her down the steps, our hands clasped like old friends. We'd sit by the window, the same one she had watched my grandfather's plane disappear from decades ago. Sometimes she'd stare at the horizon and say, "The sky remembers everything, Emily. Every storm, every light." I didn't understand what she meant then, but the words stayed with me, quietly threading themselves into my thoughts. Letters from my father began to arrive in the spring. Short, detached messages written in perfect cursive, as if emotion could be erased with neat handwriting. "Hope you're doing well. Tell Mom I'll visit soon." He never did. Grandma read each letter without a word, folded it carefully, and placed it inside a tin box on the kitchen shelf. "He's trying," I'd tell her once. She smiled faintly. "No, dear. He's remembering." By summer, the rhythm of our days felt steady. Therapy, tea, laughter, and the soft hum of the radio filled our time. But even peace has cracks. Some evenings, Grandma would grow quiet, her eyes distant, her thoughts unreachable. Once, I caught her whispering to herself, "Forgiveness is heavier than anger." I didn't press her then, but I wish I had, because behind those peaceful months, a shadow was forming, one I couldn't yet see. The same shadow that carried my father's name and would one day bring us back to the place where promises are tested, the courtroom. It was late autumn when my father finally showed up. The trees outside had shed their leaves, and the world felt stripped bare, just like the day he walked back into our lives. I still remember the sound of his car crunching on the gravel driveway, the steady rhythm of footsteps I hadn't heard in years. Grandma was resting in her chair by the window when he appeared at the door. For a moment, she didn't move. Her eyes searched his face, not for recognition, but for truth. "Thomas," she said finally, her voice steady but tired. He looked older, thinner, the kind of man who carried regrets like invisible luggage. "Mom," he said softly, "I came to see how you're doing." It wasn't a reunion. It was an echo of things left unsaid, of wounds too old to heal cleanly. I stood behind her, silent, watching the man who had vanished when she needed him most. He glanced at me briefly, then looked away. "You've changed," he said, his tone unsure whether it was a compliment or an accusation. Dinner that night was quiet. The clinking of silverware filled the space where conversation should have been. My father talked about his new job, his new house, his fresh start. Grandma listened, nodding occasionally, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her words cut through the air like a soft blade. "You always did like to start over, Thomas. You just never learned to stay." After he left, I found her sitting alone by the window again. The moonlight painted her face in silver and shadow. "He's running from guilt," she whispered. "And guilt is faster than forgiveness." I sat beside her, unsure what to say. She reached for my hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Remember this, Emily, one day, he'll come not for love, but for something he thinks he deserves." I wanted to ask what she meant, but her eyes had drifted shut, her breath slow and peaceful. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, scattering the last of the dead leaves across the yard, the sound of endings beginning again. Winter crept in quietly that year, like an old guest who no longer needed to knock. The snow came early, blanketing the farmhouse in white silence. Inside, the warmth of the fireplace became our world, a fragile bubble of light surrounded by the cold. Grandma's health began to slip again. Her hands trembled when she lifted her teacup, and her laughter, once steady as sunrise, now came and went like a breeze. I noticed the change first in her eyes. They grew softer, distant, as though part of her was already walking somewhere I couldn't follow. Some days she'd forget what year it was, other days she'd forget who had come to visit. But she never forgot one thing, me. Even in confusion, she'd reach out, squeeze my hand, and whisper, "You came back." That's all I ever needed. My father began visiting more often after that. At first, I thought it was guilt. Then I realized it was something else, preparation. He asked questions about the will, the house, the accounts. Practical things, but spoken too soon, with too little tenderness. Grandma noticed too. "He wants to own what he never loved," she said once, her voice trembling, but not from fear. I tried to reason with him, to remind him that she was still here, still breathing, still ours to love. But he brushed me off. "You don't understand how the world works," he said sharply. I wanted to shout back, to tell him I understood far too well, that the world runs on love and loss, not on ledgers. But Grandma's old advice stopped me. "Stay calm. Let them talk." The nights grew longer, colder. I'd sit by her bedside, reading aloud from her favorite book, To Kill a Mockingbird, while she drifted between sleep and waking. One night, she stirred and said softly, "Emily, don't fight him. Let the truth fight for you." I didn't fully understand her then, but her voice carried a weight that silenced the storm inside me. As January thawed into a pale, gray February, she slipped further away, her body frail, her spirit flickering like a candle's last flame. My father stood in the doorway during those final days, arms crossed, unable to step closer. I wanted to hate him for it. But watching him struggle against his own silence, I realized, some people aren't built for goodbyes. The morning my grandmother passed, the sky was a pale silver, the kind of color that holds its breath before dawn. I was sitting beside her, holding her hand, when her breathing slowed into a rhythm softer than sleep. She didn't say any last words, no grand farewell, no cinematic goodbye. She simply looked at me, her lips forming a faint smile, and then, she was gone. Just like that, quiet, graceful, certain. The same way she had lived, the world didn't stop, of course. It never does. The clock on the wall kept ticking, the sun rose, and the house filled with the stillness of absence. My father stood at the doorway again, his face pale, his eyes unfocused. "I didn't get to say goodbye," he whispered. I wanted to be angry, but all I felt was tired. "You had years," I said softly. She was waiting. He didn't respond. For once, there was no argument left in him, only silence. After the funeral, the will was read in that same small-town lawyer's office. My father sat stiffly beside me, his hands gripping the chair as if the wood could keep him steady. When the lawyer announced that Grandma had left the house to me, he didn't even look surprised. Instead, he sighed a long, weary sound and said, "She always loved you more." The words stung, but I understood something then. He wasn't jealous. He was broken. He had been all along. I didn't fight him when he asked for the car, the one Grandma had kept for decades, saying it reminded her of Grandpa. I handed him the keys quietly. Some battles aren't worth winning. Months later, as I packed up the last of her things, I found a note folded neatly inside her Bible. It was written in her familiar handwriting, careful and steady despite the tremor in her hands. "My Emily, you don't need to forgive to love, you only need to understand that some hearts never learn the language of staying. Be proud that yours did." I cried for a long time that night, not from pain, but from peace. Because in that moment, I understood her lesson. Love doesn't always stay. Sometimes it just teaches you how to, and when I stepped outside the next morning, the first light of dawn touched the frost on the window, and I swear I heard her voice in the wind, soft, certain, and full of warmth, whispering, "You came back." That's all I ever needed.